Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Anna and today I'm going to take you on a tour of my first watercolor sketchbook, the one that allowed me to refine my style and develop ideas that ultimately led to a full-time career in illustration. And if you're not new here, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope seeing this will get you even more excited to continue on your watercolor journey and inspire you to explore your ideas with color. Before my watercolor work appeared on Canadian coins, before the book covers and all the exciting work that I'm lucky to do these days, there was just this little sketchbook with some basic supplies and extreme curiosity about watercolor medium. Just like every beginner, I was a little bit confused and maybe even intimidated by watercolors, much more comfortable with gouache and ink pens. And the safety of this small book gave me courage to experiment and discover a whole new world. I started the sketchbook in 2014 with an idea that was living in my head for quite some time. I wanted to combine a sea creature and a flower in one composition, but I was too afraid to do it on a large scale because it's not something we see in real life, and I thought no one would understand it and no one would like it. At the end, it sparked an entire series of fish and flower compositions that I produced later over the years. Some of them were licensed for products, some of them were just really enjoyable personal work. The fact that I was concerned in the first place what other people might think is something that many of us go through, I think, as artists. I was very afraid to experiment with what I thought was a pretty absurd combination of subjects and worried about how my work may be judged. We prioritize other people's opinions about our creative output over our own desire to explore, and it can lead to some serious creative block. Most importantly, I think it robs us of an important opportunity to grow and practice a new medium with a sense of adventure and excitement. I still feel like that sometimes, and if you do too, try exploring your ideas in a sketchbook. Somehow I find it feels more safe, maybe because it's contained in a book that you can close and put away. Chances are you will surprise yourself. The next page of my sketchbook is completely black and white. I don't know if this ever happens to you, but I've definitely overwhelmed myself by working with watercolors and wanted to return to the safety of a more predictable medium and black and white lines, something I'm still more comfortable with simply because I've sketched all my life, usually with pen during classes and later on when I was older during work meetings. And I hope no one from my previous life in the office is watching this, so our secret is safe.
Secret? What secret?
As you can see here, I went right back to my flower fish idea next, and I picked the most exotic orchid reference I could find. My style is highly decorative here, not a traditional watercolor. Lots of swirls that I borrowed from Ukrainian folk art. And if you've been following me for a while, you know I grew up in Kiev and trained originally to paint with gouache in traditional Ukrainian style called Petrikivka. A lot of what I do these days, including my commercial work, is influenced by Ukrainian folk art, and if you're still searching for your own style, I would recommend looking into folk art of your own region. I'm convinced there is something very powerful about everyone's unique heritage that can only be revealed through creative work, something on the level of subconscious perhaps, collective memory, and tapping into it can lead you to some very exciting results. Still intimidated by watercolors, I went back to ink again, I think for the last time before I committed to watercolor in this sketchbook. And I wanted to compare the overall effect of two mediums, black and white and watercolors, on a similar subject, maybe to convince myself that watercolors offered more in terms of the visual impact. I still do this a lot where I create a similar composition using different styles or techniques just to see what works better, like in this painting of Mandarin duck. It's a very useful practice that I would recommend for any beginner and even intermediate artists, because you achieve two things: perfect your basic technique on a familiar subject when you're doing it the second time, and you explore your own stylistic preferences. So try painting the same thing two ways and observe what you like and and what you don't like. You will learn a ton about yourself and the medium you're using. This elephant was a color study for my first real commission. A co-worker who saw my early drawings took a chance and asked me for a large elephant painting, which I did later. You can imagine it meant so much at the time, and I'm so grateful to everyone who supported my artistic explorations from the start. You can see I was trying to combine ink pens and watercolor because I still wasn't confident enough to attempt a full painting with watercolor medium only. And there are many paintings I did in the same period that show the same struggle. These days I'm able to keep my watercolors more pure, so to speak, and achieve sharp edges without involving ink. Not that there's anything wrong with multimedia combinations, but at the time I just couldn't bring myself to do it, and it took me several years before I could do an entire watercolor composition without adding ink and do it with confidence. This flamingo was challenging to paint because for the first time I realized just how much the right paper really matters when working with watercolors. Since this was not 100% cotton sketchbook, although it is a very good multimedia sketchbook, I overpainted the orchids, got frustrated, and didn't even finish the center. My number one advice for anyone who wants to succeed with watercolors is to invest in the right paper and understand that certain techniques will only work on 100% cotton surface. The biggest mistake I see that beginners make is blame themselves for unsuccessful work when the real reason for watercolor frustrations in the beginning is often simply using multimedia or regular wood pulp paper instead of cotton. This fish flower composition with blue Himalayan poppy is important to me because I started sketching it in the delivery room right before giving birth to my first son, and I finished it with watercolors after he was born and we were at home. Painting is still my main form of relaxation and even meditation, which is why it doesn't matter if it's your job or hobby, it's always a great way to deal with stress or anxiety. At least that's been my experience. Let me know in comments below if you agree that art can be very healing to our mind. My son's name starts with letter R, so I sketched a letter one night. All I remember from that period is a severe lack of sleep and working on my first ever Canadian silver coin, sort of similar style as you can see using markers. The coin is in real life looks quite small, it looks like this, but this was my first ever real commercial project. A few years later, my watercolors also appeared on Canadian coins, but at that point in 2014, I wasn't confident enough with watercolor medium and only did commercial work using line drawings and continued practicing watercolors in my sketchbook. You may be wondering what this thing is, and it's a really strange caterpillar painted from a reference photo I found on Instagram. I was captivated by the colors and the silhouette and was looking at it for a while before working up a courage to ask the photographer if I can use it as a reference, and to my surprise she said yes. So thank you for this interesting creature. The main thing I learned here was that white watercolor, the little white pen that we sometimes get in the beginner sets, doesn't really work. It fades as soon as you put down your brush stroke, and it's best to just put it away and invest in some white gouache. Gouache is just opaque watercolor and it works a lot more effectively for small white details, like the whiskers on this white tiger from one of my recent tutorials on Patreon. Oh, I'm so excited to show you this page. This little sheep led me to an amazing adventure in my first solo international exhibit. At first, I simply had an idea to paint an animal from Chinese zodiac, the year of the sheep, so that's what I did. But then I got so excited and wanted to do all 12 animals of the zodiac. It took me about 2.5 years to finish these larger compositions, and I was working late through the night after my regular job, getting more and more confident with my paints over time. And my post about these watercolors went a little bit viral, I suppose, to the point that I was invited to go to Hong Kong in 2018 and have a show there. By that time we reached the year of the pig, so you can see me smiling here with a large reproduction of my watercolor piggy and some flowers, of course. Thank you, little sheep. You're the best. The next 2 pages are my favorite part because I finally felt like I was settling into my style. The blue fish and the red fish are still quite decorative and perhaps a little bit more saturated than traditional watercolor should be, still using a bit of marker, but I was finally settling into the right balance of color and detail, creating something more dynamic and using values or lights and darks to my advantage. This is the first time I didn't feel overwhelmed with color choices and was starting to understand color harmony. Notice the proportion of red versus blue in both paintings. I'm very mindful about color choices these days and talk a lot about color theory in my classes, but in those early days I was sort of just figuring it out on my own, observing different effects and testing different combinations that I read about or watched on YouTube. Blue and red is still one of my favorite color combinations and I use it a lot in different proportions, but these 2 fishes started it all. Here's another example of blue and red. Even though the flowers are pretty bad in terms of color transitions, I can probably do better now. I kind of like this as a little color study. Years later, I did an ibis watercolor for one of my Patreon tutorials, but I still like this composition better somehow, perhaps because of the movement that's implied by the open wings. We are in 2015, by the way, so almost a year since I started the sketchbook. And here I wanted to return to my ink pen again, primarily because my son still wasn't sleeping through the night, and I often sketched in the dark by his side. So the subject matter is very much parenthood inspired as well, and the composition is quite boring in my opinion, very static except for maybe a little bit of movement here that I introduced by curving the feather and trying to add some circular motion to an otherwise static drawing. You can see that I went as far as trying fish and birds together, but this was never meant to be, and I don't think I've ever tried this combination of subjects again, but it was worth a try. And looking at it now, I think I need to paint a green bee or bird again, but maybe just with some flowers. Let me know which flower you think would work best as a complement for this green bird. Another fish flower explorations where once again I was struggling to achieve soft transitions, and you can see the spots on the fish are pretty messy because watercolor didn't really spread the way it normally should spread on cotton paper, and I tried to save them by outlining everything with ink pen. Again, the reason for this is that mixed media paper doesn't allow watercolors to spread in a way that we expect, so even the best, most expensive pigments will not behave the way they should. And I remember being very frustrated about how this one turned out for that reason, and also because I didn't like my background. It took me a while to learn how to properly treat background elements with watercolor and make the most out of the medium. If you want to hear my thoughts on this subject, I summarized everything I know about watercolor backgrounds in this tutorial, and I will link it in the video description. So being unhappy with this green and red sketch, I once again went back to ink and even tried Copic markers on this frog and watercolor ink on the snake on the left and Copic markers again on the butterfly. Really dislike how this turned out, but it's fun to see the progress. About 9 years later, this is what my butterflies look like compared to the one in the sketchbook. So you can see at the time I felt completely lost, and I think we just reached summer of 2015 when I went back to my office job. So you can see I was dreaming about Friday, sketching during meetings again, and I felt like I needed a new approach to watercolor. So this is when I went to the art store across the street from my office and bought my first dot chart. As you can see, I tested every red pigment on the last page spread of the sketchbook, and 9 years later I still cherish my dot chart because it led me to much deeper understanding of the medium and convinced me that I needed to practice more, learn a little bit about the theory, and experiment without fear. So I still use ink and gouache these days, mostly for work projects, but when I want to paint for myself, I reach out for watercolors. It's a never-ending journey of discovery, and I don't think I will ever get tired of it. And if you want to learn more about watercolors, specifically how to build a gorgeous, vibrant palette, check out this video where I explain my palette technique and give you some more advanced tips. Thank you for coming along on this journey with me. I will see you soon.